Hi everyone, and welcome to Week 7, where we're looking at multiple zones of genocide in Asia. After recalling our contextualist approach to the history of genocide in the modern world system, we start by exploring the rhetorical functions of imagery in reading 1 this week, which comes from a book that's provocatively entitled Late Victorian Holocaust. At the same time, we also introduce the underexplored theme of ecology and genocide, considering the role of climate change and the social production of drought and famine. Then we look at the partition of India and issues related to gender, memory, and trauma. Next, we cover a pair of cases on opposite sides of the Cold War. First, we look at the anti-communist purges in Indonesia in 1965-66, and consider the extent to which it was perpetrated against an imaginary genos. Then we look at the killing fields of the Khmer Rouge, the communist party that ruled Cambodia from 75 to 79, and explore the bureaucratic organization of modern genocide. Finally, we come back to the political economic context behind the quote-unquote creeping genocide in the Chittagong Hill Tracts in Bangladesh. Let's start with this familiar slide, as we're once again using a set of geological metaphors to help frame our approach to the history of genocide in the modern world. Following the order of modules on our syllabus, we're ready to move on to the next geopolitical zone. Or rather, to stress the plurality of cases at stake here, the multiple zones of genocide, considering not just the great peaks above the figurative cloud line, but the smaller peaks, foothills, and valleys below as well. I need to stress the plurality at stake here of multiple geopolitical zones. Our present-day map here is just a snapshot at the surface level of history. If we go back further in time, we could see different historical snapshots of the geopolitical map. For example, check out this map of Southeast Asian empires a millennium ago. These were the large, regionalized, multi-ethnic kingdoms of early modern Southeast Asia. Kind of like we saw over the last few weeks, we could possibly trace the emergence of increasingly exclusive, ethno-religious identities that produced outbursts of unprecedented mass killing. For example, if we zoom in a bit here, we can see a rap sheet of earlier cases in this particular zone of genocide. Ben Kiernan is a historian of the region, which is covered well in his 2007 World History of Genocide, starting with the 15th century case of the Vietnamese Buddhist kingdom of Dai Viet, based in the Red River Basin of what is now northern Vietnam, and which waged against Cham people to the south. This 15th century war led to the obliteration of the kingdom of Champa as a polity, although the Cham people survived by mostly finding refuge as an ethnic minority in what's become present-day Cambodia. These are some other cases from this zone of genocide. I bring these up to make a more general point, as we see once again how a prior history of genocide is a critical risk factor for its recurrence. We'll come back to these very places in the 20th century. As I said, Southeast Asia is just one of the zones of genocide that we have to cover this week, or at least touch upon. For example, in Mark Levine's earlier volume on modern genocide up to the turn of the 20th century, he covers it in Civil War and Imperial China, where, in terms of death tolls, were devastatingly unprecedented. These cases set the stage for what was to come later, such as the Boxer Rebellion, the Civil War from 1926 to 49, Mao's famine in 1959 to 61, and the Cultural Revolution from 66 to 76. Again, the point here is the historical recurrence of genocide and other mass atrocities. Moving on, let's turn to the preface in the pages immediately prior to our selection in Reading 1. Historian Mike Davis begins by spotlighting a famous family vacation in American history, when in 1877, the newly retired President of the United States, Ulysses S. Grant, who, with his wife and son, traveled around the world. Beginning in London, the first leg of their trip brought them to the Nile River, where they witnessed a mass famine. Next, they traveled to southern India, which was suffering the worst drought in memory. Some of these images, by the way, are included in our PDF package this week, but the author doesn't cite them, although his endnotes from this part of the book references a primary source by a prominent American journalist who accompanied Grant. Now, I'm not sure if these images come from the same source, but this was an interesting case at the intersection of humanitarianism and mass media. An especially problematic aspect of mass media portrayals of humanitarian suffering is the persistent lack of context. Pictures may paint 1,000 words in terms of ethos, providing an emotional connection with its audience, but it's less effective at communicating context. Apart from brief captions such as these, I don't know much about these images. I mean, who are these people? Where are they from? I don't know. One could argue that such context is shocking images such as these are supposed to provide emotional triggers that are effective on a normative or ethical level. They are supposed to provoke our outrage. The author explicitly says as much, as he defends his use of terminology in his title, Late Victorian Holocaust. The contemporary photographs used in this book, he adds at the bottom here, are intended as accusations, not illustrations. Now, although I don't necessarily agree with this 100%, I get his point. We should be outraged by these shocking visuals. Indeed, shorn of context, we could compile a haunting archive of social suffering that should stir our very different cases: Armenia, the Holocaust, the Holodomor, North Korea. We see similar pictures today. The eternal recurrence of social suffering is a nightmare of humanity. Considering my hauntological approach to genocide studies, I'm very interested with the powerful implications of atrocity media and the provocative use of horror. Although I'm also concerned with the problems of Mike Davis's argument about Holocaust iconography. Look at these photos, which, once again, are shorn of context. Where are these people, and what caused their sufferings? And what does this all have to do with genocide, or the intentional destruction of groups? One might protest. Indeed, you may very well be asking that question with regards to reading 1, where the author makes a pretty radical argument that free market economics serve to mask colonial genocides. To be clear, Mike Davis has his own political biases, as we all do, and I've already suggested that his normative commitments may get the best of analytical rigor. I'm referring to his previous passage on the keyword Holocaust as an indictment. With that said, the rest of his argument is important to consider, insofar as it points to the infrastructural dynamics of mass death. By infrastructural, I'm referring to the big background factors that set the conditions of possibility for the formation of social structures, specifically in terms of linking ecology with political economy and society. In particular, Davis points to the drought effects of El Niño, which refers to the warm extreme phase of a vast Pacific basin. There are 2 different dimensions to drought. The first is the common sense notion of meteorological drought, in terms of insufficient rainfall. But the other is hydrological drought, which is more in terms of storage and distribution. By this latter definition, drought always has a man-made dimension and is never simply a natural disaster. The same is true of famine, which is when malnutrition is widespread and when people have started dying of starvation through a lack of access to sufficient nutritious food. So famine isn't simply the result of unavailable food, rather it's the lack of sufficient means to purchase or otherwise obtain food. Like drought, failure of planning and distribution. Now, why are we reading about this? Well, first of all, famine has been a theme of our course thus far, at least with regards to Stalin's genocides. And the ecology of genocide is a theme that I want to introduce in my revised underpinning syllabus. For example, I'm thinking of using Timothy Snyder's book, Black Earth, The Holocaust is History and Warning. But secondly, the story that Mike Davis is telling also points to the imperialist origins of the so-called Third World, as these market-induced famines set off a lasting legacy of economic underdevelopment, which just so happens to be another important risk factor for conflict and genocide. In other words, the historical ramifications of European imperialism produced certain risk factors for genocide that were not only reproduced in the mid-20th century era of decolonization, but in many ways were even amplified. We'll come back to this theme next week when we finally turn to Africa. But now we turn to Reading 2 by Indian literary and cultural historian Anaya Jahanara Kabir. Before we turn to her theoretical contributions, I need to acknowledge that this is something of a challenging read in terms of scholarly text, but I included it for 2 reasons. First is to introduce the 1947 partition of India as a case of genocide, or at least sub-genocidal violence. If you need more historical context, check out this recommended reading in our PDF package, or go to our supplementary readings folder and check out this 2003 article by Paul Brass. But this reading also returns to an important theme in our course regarding the gender dynamics of genocide. Recall this reading from week 2 on Mayan women's understandings of reparation in the aftermath of genocide. We can extend this theme into a discussion of trauma and collective memory. But first, it's crucial to consider the context and consequences involved with the British decision to partition India, which led to the formation of Pakistan as an independent state that was split into 2 separate geographic exclaves, West Pakistan and East Pakistan, the latter of which in 1971 became the independent state of Bangladesh. We'll come back to that later. But partition wasn't simply imposed by the British. It reflected the logic of the so-called two-nation thesis of religious nationalism, which was shared by the Muslim League's advocacy for Pakistani independence as a Muslim-majority nation-state, as well as by Hindu nationalism. If the numbers in Reading 7 this week are more on the high end, then conservative estimates include some 10 to 12 million displaced, plus 2 to 350,000 deaths, not to mention an untold number of rapes and other life force atrocities. This brings us to the theoretical theme of Reading 2 on the relationship between trauma and memory. Reading 2 on the relationship between trauma and memory. Trauma, which we covered in week 8 of Underpinnings, is our normal means of relating present suffering to past violence. As we saw then, unresolved trauma is another important risk factor for genocide, which is especially relevant in this case. But trauma is also, if trauma necessarily means that one has survived the traumatic episode. Now, building on the works from Holocaust studies, Kabir's literary analysis shows how unresolved traumas are often pushed beyond the reach of meaning. Paradoxically, the deployment of fiction, including nationalist mythologies, can be used to provide a sense of coherence, continuity, and closure. Now let's switch gears a bit and turn to the Cold War context by comparing two cases on either side of the ideological divide. First, let's look at the extermination of communists in Indonesia in 65 to 66. To continue our theme of prior history as a risk factor, we can see a recurrence of genocide and subgenocidal violence during the colonization of Indonesia by the Dutch. For example, the Dutch East India Company almost totally annihilated the population of the Banda Islands in 1621 in order to enforce its monopoly over the spice trade. Later, the colonial military developed and perfected a strategy intended to minimize guerrilla opposition by using ruthless, exemplary violence to, quote, awe the population into obedience. This provided the background for the violence perpetrated by either side during the War of Decolonization. For example, there were reports of mass violence committed against Dutch settlers and Chinese immigrants, although the bulk of violence was committed as a result of the Dutch's counterinsurgency. Eventually, the Dutch agreed to negotiate peace, and in 1950, an independent Republic of Indonesia was declared. Although the new country was beset by political, ethnic, and political parties waged a constant political struggle for power that led to a series of revolving governments. What triggered genocide was an attempted coup by PKI-affiliated soldiers, who were promptly put down by US-backed right-wing military officers, who thereby initiated a massive anti-communist purge. This led to a widespread campaign of mass murder that killed about 500,000 people. Now, what's interesting about this case, and what I'd like to discuss, is that although the victims were targeted on the basis of their political identity, and therefore fall outside the strict purview of the legal definition, the author of a biological phenomenon, able to be inherited and thus necessitating extermination. How does this compare with other cases of Cold War-era political violence that we've already examined, such as the Dirty Wars in Latin America or Stalin's genocide? To what extent is the genos imagined as an organic entity, even when it pertains to political affiliations? Now let's look at the other side of the Cold War divide and consider the infamous case of the Khmer Rouge. First, some political context, going all the way back to the Middle Ages and the decline of the Khmer Empire to French colonial rule in the late 19th century. In 1940, the Japanese occupied all of Indochina, including Cambodia, but left the Vichy France administration in charge of governing the colony until early 1945, when it was replaced by a short-lived Japanese administration. After the war, the French sought to retain Indochina and struggled against Cambodian independence, which wasn't fully achieved until 1953. Just as French forces were about to lose the First Indochina War, the subsequent American War in Vietnam, or the Second Indochina War, spilled over into Cambodia, where, starting in 1968, the Cambodian Communists, aka the Khmer Rouge, began a civil war against the government, ultimately gaining power in 1975. They captured the capital city of Phnom Penh in April of that year and began a wholesale evacuation of all civilians to the countryside, where they set out to transform Cambodia into an autarkic, agrarian, communist state through a program of rapid collectivization and the formation of rural labor camps. The economic goal was basically the same agenda as Stalin's in Russia, to dramatically boost food production and industrialization. In that sense, the Khmer Rouge was part of a global pattern of authoritarian high modernism, which we've seen before, driven by a muscular vision of progress, combined with a strong willingness to use coercive power to implement a radical program of social engineering. This brings us to reading 4 by James Tyner, Engineering. This brings us to reading 4 by James Tyner, who analyzes the notorious Khmer Rouge Detention Center, S21, as a site of necropolitics. The encyclopedic entry in recommended reading 9 this week provides a bit more information about this atrocity site, which is now an important genocide museum. Towards the end of reading 4 is Cameroonian philosopher Akile Mbembe's take on the Foucaultian notion of biopolitics, which we covered in week 6 of Underpinnings. Tyner uses this conceptual vocabulary to characterize S21 as a synthesis of massacre and bureaucracy. With this in mind, focus on the author's analytical focus on the politics of list as inscription devices that perform as a specific technique of government. What are the functions of list, especially as part of security discourses and the paranoid genocidal subjectivity? Finally, let's conclude with reading 5 this week, where we read an older piece by Mark Levine, who looks at the attempted destruction of the indigenous peoples of the Chittagong Hill Tracts in the frontier region of Bangladesh. Again, let's start with some background on the bloody origins of Bangladesh, which, as noted earlier, was formerly the exclave of East Pakistan. In 1971, there was a revolt in East Pakistan in the context of the Third. In response, the Pakistani military attempted to commit genocide against the Bangladeshi independence movement, resulting in the deaths of an estimated 3 million people. This was how Bangladesh was born. And this is the context for Levine's argument, which by now should look familiar. What do you make of his thesis, which is that states commit genocide because they see it as being in their developmental interest to do so? How is genocide a high-risk strategy? And what do you make of his concept of a, quote, creeping genocide? It's worth noting that this article is over 20 years old, and Levine's research agenda has advanced significantly since then. So too has his conceptual vocabulary. So in our textbooks, he often refers to situations such as these as sub-genocidal. What these concepts have in common is the reference to situations where specific intent may be absent, or at least not yet evident, but where physical elimination is nevertheless present.